Oliver Twist is an extreme criticism of Victorian society's treatment of the poor. The workhouses that figure prominently in the first few chapters of the novel were institutions that the Victorian middle class established to raise poor children, since it was believed that certain vices were inherent to the poor and that poor families fostered rather than discouraged such vices. Poor husbands and wives were separated in order to prevent them from having children and expanding the lower class. Poor children were taken away from their parents in order to allow the state and the church to raise them in the manner they believed most appropriate. In the narrative, the workhouse functions as a sign of the moral hypocrisy of the working class. Mrs. Mann steals from the children in her care, feeding and clothing them inadequately. The Victorian middle class saw cleanliness as a moral virtue, and the workhouse was supposed to rescue the poor from the immoral condition of filth. However, the workhouse in Dickens' novel is a filthy place. Mrs. Mann never ensures that the children practice good hygiene except during an inspection. Workhouses were established to save the poor from starvation, disease, and filth, but in fact they end up visiting precisely this hardship in the poor. Furthermore, Mr. Bumble's action underscore middle-class hypocrisy, especially when he criticized Oliver for not gratefully accepting his dire conditions. Bumble himself, however, is fat and well-dressed, and the entire workhouse board is full of fat gentlemen who preach the value of a meager diet for workhouse residents. The assumption on the part of the middle-class characters that the lower classes are naturally base, criminal, and filthy serves to support their vision of themselves as a clean and morally upright social group. The gentlemen in the workhouse board call Oliver a savage, who is destined for the gallows. After Oliver's outrageous request for more food, the board schemes to apprentice him to a brutal master, hoping that he will soon die. Even when the upper classes claim to be alleviating the lower class predicament, they only end up aggravating it. Dickens achieves his biting criticism of social condition through deep satire and hyperbolic statements. Throughout the novel, absorbed characters and situations are presented as normal, and Dickens often says the opposite of what he really means. For example, in describing the men of Parish Board, Dickens writes that they were very sage, deep, philosophical men. Parts of Dickens' motivation for writing Oliver Twist was to expose the horrid conditions in which the lower classes were expected to live, and as a result, much of the narrative focuses on the sensationally disgusting settings in which the poor live their lives. In protesting the parish treatment of Oliver, Dickens criticizes the Victorian characterization of the poor as naturally immoral, criminal, and filthy. Just as Nancy assumes a middle-class identity by changing her clothing, Oliver sheds his identity as an orphan pickpocket when he leaves behind his pauper's clothes. Brownlow purchases an expensive new suit for him. Oliver thus assumes the identity of a gentleman's son by wearing the clothing of a gentleman's son. After he dons his new clothing, Mr. Brownlow asks him what he might like to be when he grows up. At a workhouse, the authorities never even bothered to ask Oliver his opinion in the matter of his apprenticeship. In Victorian England, even more than today, an individual's profession determined a large part of his or her identity. The fact that no one at the workhouse asked for Oliver's opinion regarding his apprenticeship shows, once again, how much he is denied the right to define himself. Oliver's situation symbolically represents the silence of the poor. The poor cannot define their social identity. Instead, the empowered classes define the identity of the poor for them.